everyone. This is Tom Mosley, and welcome. Welcome to the number one, the inaugural Ease into Retirement podcast. Now, some of you may have received this and you clicked on a link and you're listening to me talk right now, and you say, what is a podcast? Well, a podcast in the digital age is probably the most effective way of communicating. It's like 40 years ago, if you wanted to communicate this way, you might go get a radio show and start a show on the radio where each week you would teach on something on financial terms. And in our current day and time, there are a gazillion podcasts out there when it comes to financial advice and financial services. And a gazillion simply means, in real common language, a whole lot of podcasts out there. But most of them that I've seen focus on advisors teaching other advisors. My goal is to be educational to what we would call clients, to real people, to people who are actually taking the financial advice and putting together a plan for themselves, or working with someone to put together a plan for themselves. And our goal is that we'll save these podcasts and we'll build a library on our website, 𝐒𝐎𝐈𝐓𝐇.com, and people will be able to go back, and if they have an interest in a certain subject that we've covered in prior podcasts, they'll be able to look at it, educate themselves, and at least learn something about their concern or the issue that they want to talk about. I want to help pre-retirees, those are those people just about to retire, and I want to help those people that are in retirement make sure they don't run out of money if it's at all possible. I want to make sure they don't get and follow bad advice that cost them dearly, and when they're 85 years old, they're dusting off the resume to go back to work. Now, I'm an old football coach, so a lot of my illustrations on this podcast week to week will be football illustrations. But when you get to the 20-yard line in football, you're in what's called the red zone. From there, you can smell the goal line from there. Coaches, quarterbacks, offensive teams are judged by how well they perform in the red zone. I want to tell you, the red zone of financial planning is those 5 or 6 years before you're able to retire, right up to the 5 or 6 years after you retire. If you make a mistake in that red zone of financial planning, then those mistakes can really carry ramifications on you, particularly when God gives you a long life and you're 85 and you're 87 and you're 88. Those mistakes that you might make during that shortly before and shortly after retirement period, the red zone, are really, really crucial. In 1995, when I first got into financial services, I was working for this little office out of Pasadena, California. And Bruce, the guy who was my mentor, called me into his office and said, "You've passed all your license. Now we want to get you out there and start working with people. Who do you want to work with?" Well, I quickly came back and I said, "I want to work with retirees." And he looked at me literally like I had just said something from outer space in a foreign, unknown language. He said, "What?" He said, "You don't want to work with doctors or lawyers or pharmacists or some specialty. You want to work with retirees?" Well, you got to keep in mind, in 1995, retirees, or shall we call it baby boomers of our day, were only 50 years old. Most of them hadn't thought about retiring yet, or they were putting away money in a 401k, but they weren't close to retirement. And he said, "Why would you want to do that?" Well, for 15 years before I got into financial services, I had been in the ministry. And it seems that every church I'd ever been at, they'd always put me in charge of benevolence. And benevolence is that part of the budget of a church that they set aside, and they say that's where we're going to help people who are in need. Multiple times, more times than I ever want to remember, I have had people come to me in their 70s and early 80s, and they were literally trying to make a decision: do they buy food or do they buy medicine? So I explained that to Bruce, and I said, "Bruce, I want to help people get to a point where as best we can make sure they don't run out of money regardless of how long God allows them to live. He said, okay, but there's certainly not very many people doing that. Well, let's fast forward now to 2020. There are tons of people that are out there working with retirees now. You want to make sure that if you're getting advice, you're not getting advice from somebody who really focuses on 25 to 40-year-old people who are amassing wealth, or 40 to 50-year-old people who've got a little wealth, and they'll say, well, you need to call us if you've got at least $500,000 put away for retirement. You need to make sure you're listening to somebody who's helping you make sure you don't run out of money in retirement as best as possible. Now, on this retirement, and this is, like I said, the first of what I hope will grow to be a weekly podcast. On this retirement, we're going to focus on education. I've got a master's degree from Dallas Seminary. I've got an MBA from Pepperdine with a concentration in finance. I train with Ed Slott. I'm a Dave Ramsey SmartVestor Pro. And I'm also taking a course right now from American College called the Retirement Income Certified Professional. And it's amazing. It says on page 5 of the first year's curriculum, it says a naive investor would only focus on growing their assets rather than building, with the ultimate goal of long-term income in mind. Folks, that's what they're talking about retirement. There are 6 major decisions you need to make as you approach retirement. When to retire? What do we do about Social Security? What do we do about the pension? How are we going to take care of income? Major questions about investments. And the American College has done surveys, and they found out that people who get advice on that and people who make the right decisions can literally have 38% more income in retirement by making the right decisions. The bottom line is, you need to be more concerned about making sure that you have long-term income when you enter retirement than you do when you're 40 years old. You're really concerned about your investments. But it's not your lump sum in retirement that makes the difference. It's your income and making sure that that income lasts as long as you do. And the plan should never be, well, I'm going to spend it all, and then when I get to be 85 years old, if I'm still alive, I'm going to decide which kid I'm going to move in with and live the rest of my life with. That should never be your plan.
Hey folks, thank you for listening to today's episode of the Ease into Retirement podcast with Tom Mosley. Just a quick reminder that if anything you've heard so far today has hit home for you, maybe it's something you're dealing with, maybe it's just something you want to learn a little bit more about, there will be a complimentary downloadable giveaway on Tom's website specifically prepared for this week's episode that you should check out. Just go to 𝐒𝐎𝐿𝑒spodcast.com. That's EASE podcast.com. Click the button with the title of this week's episode and get your copy today. Now I'll throw it back to Tom.
Now, one of the biggest retirement problems that are out there, and by the way, we're all first-timers with retirement. Nobody's ever done it before. Nobody's ever been in retirement before until you're in retirement. It's like parenting. I mean, God gives you these kids and you've got to raise them, and you've never been a parent before. And then after you get it all done and you learn all the good ways to do it and the bad ways to do it, there's no do-overs. Maybe you get to help out with your grandkids. So the biggest problems that I see in retirement is that people just make decisions without being properly educated. So in this podcast, the plan is for us to talk about all kinds of subjects. There are 18 different risks that you will face in retirement. And one of them is really, when you think about it, it's a blessing. let's say I want to live a long life. I want to see my grandkids graduate. I want to see my grandkids get married. I want to see this, or I want to do that, or I want to live to 90. Do you realize that's a risk to your retirement portfolio? It's a longevity risk. You're going to live a long, long time. And a lot of people say, well, what about the products? What are ETFs? What are mutual funds? What are iShares? What's an IRA? A 401k, most people know because you had to sign up for one when you started to work somewhere. What's an annuity? Should I use an annuity? I've always been told negative stuff about an annuity, but now I need a guaranteed source of steady income that I'm not going to outlive. Maybe now an annuity will work. And what are taxes going to do to my retirement? You know, if you've got $800,000 in a 401k, it's not all your money. Now, I like to tell a lot of illustrations, and I in 26 years, I've run into a lot of people, and I've got a lot of illustrations, and I never give out anybody's name, so I just call them George and Myrtle. Okay, so if you're named George or you're named Myrtle, just overlook it. Imagine I'm saying some other name. But I was teaching a class in Yorba Linda about 5 years ago, and I simply threw out there that if you've got $800,000 in a 401k, or I believe I said that day, if you've got $400,000 in a 401k, it's not all your money. And there was this little lady sitting behind a table on my right side, and I can see her just like it was today. I thought she was going to jump over the table and beat me up. She said, "What do you mean it's not all my money?" She said, "My company never matched. I started a 401k," and she said, "I don't have 400,000." And it was really funny. She said, "But I've got $357,458.69 this morning." I mean, she knew to the T. And she said, "That's all my money." Well, I explained to Myrtle that day that when she starts taking that money out of the 401k, and how she starts taking that money out of the 401k is going to make a difference with how much of it is hers versus how much of it is the government's, because they're going to tax every single thing that comes out. Big decisions in retirement about how do I get taxed on my 401k, and what's the best way and when's the best time to take the money out so that I can avoid paying every single tax I can legally avoid. Those are the kind of things we're going to address on this podcast. When do I turn on Social Security? I train with a group on Social Security every single year, and they pointed out that there's 260 different choices that a married couple can make in taking their Social Security. How do I deal with health care? How do I deal with Medicare? Do I go with Medicare Advantage or Medicare supplements? Those are things that we will deal with on this podcast in future episodes. What about long-term care? Listen to me closely. Everybody needs a long-term care plan. And a long-term care plan is simply, how will I deal with long-term care? Now, you may decide to pay for it yourself. You may decide to pay for it with an actual long-term care policy. You may decide to set aside a bulk of money in a certain bucket over here, we'll call it, and you may use that in case you need it for long-term care. And if you never have to tap it, that's just money that you can leave to your kids. So the idea of the podcast is going to be to educate you on different areas as we go through the years and we look at it. Now, simply to start, it's going to be me, and I'm going to talk about these different subjects, but I'm sure you'll grow bored with me and tired with me. So we'll branch out, and I will bring in industry experts like David Bach, who's a good friend of mine, and other people, and I will bring them in, and they will be on the podcast. The plan, as I've said, is to be about one time every week, and maybe we'll set a certain day and put it out on Monday or put it out on Friday or some set day. We'll work toward doing that. Now, I need you to help me. Here's what I need you to do. I got 5 things. Number 1, I need you to listen to the podcast. There's an old joke that when you first start doing podcast, only your mother and your sister listen to the podcast. Well, I got really bad news on both cases. My mom passed away about 12 years ago, and I've never had a sister, so I need you to listen to this podcast. Number two, if you like what you hear, I need you to share it. You know a lot more Georges and Myrtles than I do. And if you listen to something and it's worthwhile to you, share it with your friends, share it with your relatives, pass the podcast on along. Number three, subscribe. There'll be links at the end of this podcast where you can subscribe, and that'll help you. It'll get you notified as to when we put out future podcasts, and you'll get a little email, and it'll also help us build up credibility with the podcast. Number three, I need your feedback. If there's something that I deal with and you have further questions, you can email me. It's simply tom@𝐒𝐎𝐈𝐓 spell it out, EASEINTO, retirement.com. So I need you to come back with me with any questions you have about what we deal with. And number five, not just feedback, but suggestions. If there are guests that you'd like to have, if there are subjects that you'd like us to cover, if there are particular issues that are going on that you would like to address, I need you to listen, share, subscribe, give me feedback, and then I also need you to give me suggestions. And again, the best way is to just get back to me at tom@easeintoretirement.com. Now, here's the bottom line. Please listen closely. I want to earn the right to be the first person that you think about when you or somebody you know has a financial or an investment or a retirement planning question. And I want to be able to address it on this podcast in general, but if they have a specific issue, you get in touch with me, tom@easeintoretirement.com. You can call me at the office, 714-421-4288. That's 714-421-4288. And I'll be glad to help you and answer your questions or any of your questions in any way I possibly can. So signing off for the first time, the first, the inaugural, the number one Ease into Retirement podcast. Until next time, this is Tom Mosley. I look forward to seeing you on this podcast in the future.
Investment advisory services offered only by duly registered individuals through 𝐂𝐈𝐓 Wealth Management, LLC. 𝐂𝐈𝐓 Wealth Management and Mosley Insurance and Financial Services are not affiliated companies. Investing involves risk, including the potential loss of principal. Any references to protection, safety, or lifetime income generally refer to fixed insurance products, never securities or investments. Insurance guarantees are backed by the financial strength and claims-paying abilities of the issuing carrier. This podcast is intended for informational purposes only. It is not intended to be used as the sole basis for financial decisions, nor should it be construed as advice designed to meet the particular needs of an individual's situation. Mosley Insurance and Financial Services is not permitted to offer, and no statement made during this show shall constitute tax or legal advice. Our firm is not affiliated with or endorsed by the U.S. government or any governmental agency. The information and opinions contained herein provided by third parties have been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, but accuracy and completeness cannot be guaranteed by Mosley Insurance and Financial Services.